Hi guys, I'm back again with another review. Today we're going to be talking about Neuromancer by William Gibson. Neuromancer is a cyberpunk dystopian science fiction novel, the debut novel in fact, by William Gibson, and is credited with creating the entire cyberpunk subgenre, which is in itself incredibly impressive. So before we even get into the goods and the bads of this book, we need to award it a star because it invented a subgenre of science fiction, and that's amazing. That's got to be worth a star, of course. So gets 1 star straight away. Now, what is this book about? You may be wondering. Neuromancer is a title that gives absolutely nothing away. So Neuromancer is the story of a guy called Case, who is like a down and out computer hacker. He's your typical pulp slash noir sort of hero, in so far as that he's not really a hero at all, kind of a piece of shit, but like he's basically this whiz kid computer hacker, and he is co-opted along with this woman called Molly, who has like cybernetic Wolverine claws almost, to work for this guy called Armitage to do something. And they aren't told what the job is when they're co-opted into it, but through different sort of motivations, they're forced onto this job basically. So it's it's a pretty basic pulp setup for a book. It's like these guys. It's like, imagine like an Ocean's 11 style thing. It's basically your classic heist movie setup, but it's set in this sort of really interesting science fiction world. So, without further ado, let's start talking about the positives, because it's nice to be nice. So, the positives, the overall setting of this book is absolutely incredible. Obviously, I talked about how William Gibson is basically a visionary in terms of science fiction, creating the cyberpunk genre, but that really goes into his setting. Like, there's so much in here that feels like it must have been incredibly well researched, or Gibson just is like a psychic genius who saw how technology would develop over the next sort of 40 years, because holy shit, like he gets so much spot on for having written this in the 80s. Like the 80s was a time when the internet certainly didn't exist, and for the most part people didn't have like personal computers in their homes like they would now. Obviously, like that sort of stuff is getting there, but wasn't nowhere near as prolific as it is now. Like people have fucking computers in their pockets these days. But Neuromancer is set in a world that is really eerily quite like our own now. Obviously, there's certain things that aren't true of today, like there's no Rastafarians living in space colonies, but we can ignore that and get on with the fact that yeah, he got things right. He predicted the internet, he predicted computer hackers. Like, this is a story about computer hackers written in a time before the internet existed. How bizarre is that? It's crazy. The world building, like all the different corporations and things, they're all really well fleshed out, and the overall setting is just like, it's really good. It's on point, so it gets a star for that, for like creating this world. This is a star for like writing style, in case you're wondering where they're falling. So we've got 1 for creative ideas and we've got 1 for writing style, and combining into that is this great use of imagery that he uses. This book probably has one of the most famous opening lines in history, which ironically is now actually quite outdated. I'll read you the opening line. It says, "The sky above the port was the colour of television tuned to a dead channel." Now, for you youngsters who may not remember big CRT TVs, when you used to tune a television to a dead channel, you got static, which is like grey and black specks. You might have seen it once or twice in your life, but now obviously if you tune a TV to a dead channel, it's blue. So that line doesn't really hold up, which is ironic considering how visionary it is, but it's that use of imagery and metaphor that really carries through the whole book. And it's a very Raymond Chandler style quote. Raymond Chandler style quote. It's a very Raymond Chandler style technique. And apparently somebody from The Observer reviewed this book as saying Gibson is the Raymond Chandler of sci-fi, which I can absolutely agree with. Unfortunately, what he does do is borrows more traits of Chandler's that are not so good than ones that are good. And now we need to talk about the negatives, basically, because, well, we've gone through all the good bits. So, negatives. Characters. Characters are a big one in this book. They're very, very flimsy. Very one-dimensional. They don't have any real driven motivations. A lot of the characters are very passive, and are then given motivations down the road, which is okay, but it means that they don't have a strong investment in the story. Some are better than others. Definitely, like certain characters that are introduced later in the story are not nearly as good. Like Case himself is quite interesting. He's got like a very moral, like he's very morally dubious, but I don't think any of the characters really has a strong arc. They all basically wind up in the same place that they begin the story in terms of character growth, which is obviously not that strong. The other problem with the characters is that they don't have very strong voices. By that I mean when the characters are talking to each other, if it didn't say them by name, you wouldn't know who was talking to who. Like they all speak the same. They all have the same thoughts and opinions and stuff. It's a bit odd. So characters are very weak. And tying into that, Gibson decides that there should be a romance subplot between Case and Molly, but he really jumps the gun on that and doesn't earn it at all. It's introduced far too early in the book, which really ruins the pacing of that particular subplot. It's introduced far too early, and then like there's no motivation behind it. It doesn't make sense for the characters to get together in the way that they do, especially since there's another character that Gibson is trying to make you, like, he keeps recurring this other character, which is like a secondary romance subplot for Case, but it's really weird. It's really out of place. So the romance elements in the books are not good. They're very gratuitous. Like, I can't really tell you a lot about the descriptions of places, but I can tell you the exact description of Molly's nipples, because that was very important to Gibson to write about. So, going on to that point, there's no actual solid description, really, in this book. A lot of the reviews I've seen from people have said the plot is very hard to follow. And I would 100% agree with that. The plot is very hard to follow, but not because it has confusing ideas. It's not very complex. It's quite simple A to B stuff. The problem is because, as I say earlier, like, he uses imagery really well, but he doesn't use concrete description, like, ever. So characters end up doing actions in like a blank void in your mind because there's not enough for you to build a clear picture off of, which is okay, I suppose. Like, Raymond Chandler does that as well in The Big Sleep, and it was something I was going to criticize him for in that, but I let it go because obviously The Big Sleep takes place in the real world, so I can sort of fill in the blanks in my mind if I have to. Unfortunately, with Neuromancer, a lot of the stuff is like, there's a Rastafarian space colony, but it's not described at all. I don't know what that looks like. And I never will, because Gibson certainly doesn't care to tell me. So that is really not great. It makes it very difficult to really get a grasp of what's going on, and where and when. It all becomes very floaty, which maybe that was like his point, I don't know, but it doesn't make for a good read, and I'm happy to say that because obviously that comment lines up with everything I've read from everyone else. So I know it's not just a me thing. Now, finally, I alluded to this in my last review. There is a pacing problem in this book that is just unforgivable. And that is that right before the climax of the book, it just hits the brakes and pulls you straight out of it. And that is absolutely atrocious. Like, the plot starts to move along a fairly steady pace throughout the whole book. Obviously, there's some misinformed like inclusions of random subplots, which don't really go anywhere and are a bit pointless. But overall, the main story's pacing is fine until we get right to the end, when it just takes a giant dump. And it really, like, I will not lie, I skipped through the part which just, like, it literally, like, it's so like night and day, just pulls you straight out. And I skipped through that. I skimmed through that part as quick as I possibly could, just to get back to what we were doing. And then the ending was wrapped up within about 3 pages, which is completely pointless. There's so much you could have dedicated. The book's not even 300 pages long. Like, you could have dedicated more time to the things that were important and less time to this meaningless bullshit in a desperate attempt to develop Case's character right at the end. It was pointless. It was really bad. So ultimately, the book only gets 2 stars. I'm not going to say it was unenjoyable. I did have a decent enough time reading the vast majority of the book. When it gets to the last 20-30 pages, that's when it started to wobble. But for the most part, it's an enjoyable read. It only gets 2 stars because obviously the pacing wasn't great. The characters were pretty weak. And, like, you know, just the plot was just difficult to follow. Like that. So those 3 areas, it just let itself down with. But the writing style is very interesting, and definitely readable. And obviously William Gibson, as I say, he's a visionary, and that can't be denied. So 2 stars altogether. It's not a horrendous read. If you're interested in the origins of Cyberpunk, if you've read other Cyberpunk stuff, maybe give it a go if you want to see how it is. But don't expect too much. It's not very long, as I say, it's under 300 pages, so you can probably breeze through it fairly quickly. It's a relatively enjoyable pulp-style book, and that's about it, really. So thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time with another review or video or something. See you then.